A room without books is like a body without a soul.
Hello and welcome to Sundaku, the podcast for anybody who would happily waste time in a bookshop. I'm Annie Hastwell.
And I'm Kath Keneally.
Kath, what have you been reading?
Well, I've been going back to Maggie G, G-E-E, Maggie G, who I stumbled across when I picked up a book when I was on holiday once called My Driver. And it's about a very entitled English woman. I think she's in Africa. She has an African driver, and it's a fantastic dissection of colonialism, really. And she is right on top of all of those big issues. Strongly feminist, deeply political. This one that I hadn't read before is called Blood. It's from 2019, and just before that I read the reissue of The White Family that I hadn't read. That was published 20 years ago. It was about the UK then and now, but very much then, an extremely racially prejudiced family, one of whose daughters marries an African British man and is excommunicated, and it's in the voices of all of the people in that family. It's stunningly good.
Wow, who knew? I don't even know about Maggie G.
Well, Blood, she's dark. I mean, this is the story of the daughter of a horrendously abusive and inventively cruel dentist father. And
I'm not sure I really want to read this.
Well, I mean, it's not what you think, but he is a very nasty, tyrannical father, and it's the daughter grown up and the things she's going through. The Ludds is the name of the family, artistes of awfulness. The woman says herself, I'm one of them. I share the bad blood, and yet I have my softer side. As you'll see if you stay with me, I am more sinned against than sinning. Anyway, I just think she's absolutely wonderful.
Wow,
and,
you always introduce me to something I've never, ever heard of. I think I'm just one of those basic, check out what are the best reads in the bookshop. Because I'm reading Yellowface, which I think lots and lots of people are reading, but it is, just cannot put it down. It's one of those books where the first line just grabs you and you can't stop after that. And I'd also bought her next book, Babel, as in the Tower of Babel,
yes,
which looks very different and also really interesting. So, yes. And I've got the Booker winner, Kairos, by Jenny Erpenbeck, translated from the German. Tell you all about that sometime soon.
good.
Kath, today, another Irish author, but one that's been living in Australia for a very long time and has quite an elegant British accent, I noticed. Finnegan Kruckemeyer. Tell us about him.
Well, Finn, I would call an Adelaide boy. In fact, I knew Finn ages ago when he was just starting out as a playwright, and he's made his name as a playwright. He was living in Adelaide at the time. I don't know how long he lived in Ireland, but the family moved to Australia. And then as his fame grew, he moved from Adelaide to Hobart, and I think he was there for 15 years. And now he's come back to Adelaide again, but with a first novel called The End and Everything Before It.
And after that, we'll be talking to our regular discusser of classics, Annie Warburton. She's also busily trying to visit every country in the world at the moment, but I caught her between trips. And we've talked about quite a few famous dead white male authors, but she's changed tack. Today it's dead white females. In fact, the wonderfully outrageous Mitford family.
Oh, wonderful. Which one? Who's she been reading?
Mainly Nancy, but we get to hear about all of them, including the Hitler groupie.
Yeah, Unity.
What a family. Amazing.
Annie, let me introduce you and our listeners to Finnegan Kruckemeyer, who theatregoers might know as a very well-established now Australian playwright. He has published his first novel. It's getting a lot of attention. It's called The End and Everything Before It. I don't think he's absolutely taken off his playwriting hat, because we meet character by character, and each of the characters has a kind of symbolic quality to them. It's almost, I used the word Brechtian with him, and he raised his eyebrows, but that's how it struck me. It's a most unusual novel, but I think you'll like it very much. And so the question that I asked Finn was, after all this time, what was it about the novel form that drew him? What was it that he thought he could only say in a novel and not a play?
When I thought about novels, I thought back to those really formative encounters with art and the way that I fell in love with art. And it was through books. It was totally books. That was what I read as a little kid on a hill in Ireland. And then when I came to Australia, that was, how I'd kind of passed the time when I wasn't out and about in this sunny country. And it just endured all the way through. And then theatre was a discovery, and theatre communities were a discovery, and they explained a lot to me about, what a job could be and what the world could be and all the fun you could have with that. But books were this enduring thing. So I thought one day I'll turn my hand to it. One day I'll try to write a book. And I kept waiting for permission. I kept waiting for that moment to present itself, for there to be a gap in my playwriting work. And I applied for funding and thought, okay, if I have some money, that kind of explains to me that I have a period of time when I can be doing this. And I never got the funding. The funding bodies always said, you're a playwright. And that was that. And then in this bittersweet way, my then wife got very sick at the start of 2022. And suddenly our world became really small. Suddenly for 1 year we were inside and the agenda was really simple. And within that there were these periods of time, of course, when I'd be left to my own devices and I could write a book. And the book explains to me, if I break it down to myself, the year that was and kind of the preceding years of hoping to write something and how to emulate my heroes and the stories I love and what a year is. And it all kind of culminated in this crazy 2 months of blur, and the book just poured out.
Well, that explains in a way the kind of cosmic feel of the book, that it's about life, death, birth, generations, the universe and everything. And it's called The End and Everything Before It. And I wondered about that title and I thought, how exactly were you trying to tease us in with that title?
Delusions of grandeur for sure. I'll just write about everything there is. It wasn't the working title right up until I had started this lovely relationship with Text, who published it and have just been these amazing handholders and fonts of wisdom throughout the whole process. It was called something else, and that was the name of the final chapter, The End and Everything Before It. And then Jane, the publisher and editor, said, I think that encapsulates it. I think the scale of the thing, how much it's trying to make reference of, it's kind of a clue, but it's not a clue. It's a poem of a title. That's kind of what I liked about it, the sense that it could be read however one needs to read it.
It's a very beautiful lyrical book. It's going to be a hard one to talk about in terms of narrative arc, characters, the usual thing. You're asking us to put our heads in an unusual space. And I wonder whether you've completely changed your spots as a playwright, because we meet the characters one by one. They're given their own watertight scenes and they're given symbolic, emblematic sorts of names. You were saying that David Astle called it a cryptic crossword of a novel. It is, because you jump from place to place from time to time. You don't pinpoint a location. We have to do a lot of the work ourselves.
Yes, that's right. And I don't mind those kind of games. I don't mind them in a cryptic crossword or in a piece of art or in a life, I think, where you view a moment as a thing that it is, or a person as a thing that they are, that you take them to be, and then you get a changing of perspective. Something occurs, you learn some history, or you have a future encounter and you rewrite your perception of who that person is or what they were meant to be. I judged the characters a lot as I was writing them, and then very pleasingly I also discovered that I misjudged the characters a lot as I was writing them, and I took them to be one thing and then they kind of explained themselves anew, and that felt okay because I hadn't written a novel before, because I haven't ever gone to uni or learned how to write a novel or anything like that. I just felt that was all right. If it felt like this new meeting of a character was giving them more context and more weight and more dimensions, then I would just lean into it and write to that. And the moment it stopped ringing true, that's when I'll get the red pen out and try to fix what felt wrong or felt false.
Well, it's a kind of emblematic story. Let's try and pin it down a little bit. We're covering about 2 centuries here. Well, there's a coast to start with. People come to the coast, they start farming, Somebody suggests a town would be a good idea. We get a town. Things happen in the town. You focus on a few key people in that coastal location and then hold on to your hats because people zoom in from different times. We have characters almost out of Gaelic legend. Emma, she's wandering the seas. She's the one we meet first.
Yes.
She's in self-imposed exile because she thinks somehow she's the kiss of death for anyone she meets.
Yep.
How many key characters besides Emma? I think there are about half a dozen.
The book is broken into 5 parts, but it felt good to meet everybody that we had to really get a sense of quite early on. And so, yeah, there's Emma who's wandering and feels herself to be quite tragic and needs to be proven not tragic. You know, the hope needs to be discovered in her narrative. There's Connor, who is an orphan who's growing up, and those two may find their way to each other. There's the founder, who sounds totally functionary in terms of the role that he's to play in terms of building a community, but then I tried to create more sides to him so that his worthiness could be questioned in a way. You know, he's got colour to his history. There's Nella, who has a sense of emotionally digging people. She can kind of look into the minutiae of who people are. There's Liz, who is troubled and absent, and her absence is kind of the way that you meet her, the negative space that she creates. And then there's Anya, who becomes this kind of hinging character who kind of takes us through the book. From a certain point, she becomes our guide. Each of them was just kind of jostling for space in my head at different times.
Yeah.
And I just kind of tried to go with that to see whose voice was taking precedence at that moment. And if I felt, all right, let's fling it back 150 years, I would just do it. It was silly. It was silly, but yeah.
It was great. I mean, you said you didn't have a clue how to write a novel, but I think this one just proves that a novel can be what you want a novel to be. That's the whole point. Mm-hmm. So in this one, we just open our minds to the fact that some people are wandering across place and time. As I reread it, I thought, who's the real key character? And I think I ended up deciding it was Liz. Can we say a little bit about Liz without too much?
Just that sense, yeah. She's the one whose magic is named. They all possess elements of magic.
Yeah.
There's these permissions given to different characters in different ways. With her, she kind of articulates it as a thing she can do, which is this ability to move through time and place, not as she sees fit, but kind of as she is encumbered by. She kind of is just flung into different moments, and then she has to make sense of them and build a logic around where she is. At times, she can hold those moments, she kind of has ownership of them, and at times she seems lost and a bit floundering. She was the enigma for me, which is why at a later point in the novel I felt I really had to give her voice. And in doing so, there was this kind of retrospective logic created, which just made me breathe out.
Yeah, it took some figuring out as a reader, which I loved. And then I started to wonder at the end just how many relationships Liz had been in with the characters. I think I figured it out. You don't give us a location, but you give us some clues. And you and I both have a Tasmanian past. Yes. So you've got orchards on a river, you've got apple barges going down the river to the coast, and I'm thinking, I think I know where we are. At least I got the feeling that might have been what put you in the mood or gave you a sense of where you wanted your characters to be a couple of 100 years ago. And then through the foundations of a town and almost out the other side of the town to where a forest is being replanted on a hill that had an institution on it which played a key part in the lives of several generations.
Yes.
Can you talk about that place and particularly the hill and the house, the building on the hill?
Yeah, I liked an agrarian notion. I thought if this is about the founding of a community and the way that people are kind of working with bedrock and laying the foundations for the generations that will follow, why not give it this agrarian kind of context where there's different jobs that people hold and cumulatively they make a population and they give context to a population and things grow and the seasons affect things. It's coastal, so you're buffeted by elements, by the weather. There's climate changing in it, so you can see a period of years and things that were a given cease to be. That was one of the big things about discovering what a book can afford you. I could write the landscape as another character, and I've never really done that before. This was the landscape speaking, and that felt really pleasurable to write. And then, there was symbolism getting attached to it, which is what happens, what humans, with our weird need to stamp and explain to ourselves. I think we do that with landscapes. And so, there is a barren hill atop which sits an institutional kind of building which plays different roles at different times, and everybody has different encounters with it, and rarely through choice. They're burdened by that place, and symbolically it sits on high, it sits atop, it looks over everything. It's, the opposite of a lighthouse. It's not really saving anyone, but it's existing for everyone. But what it is, because it's a hill and because gravity exists and people cascade, it's also a place of leaving as well as arriving at. And so it's an invitation for people to acknowledge harder times and then to move to easier ones and to build lives that they would wish to build, or to be invited into other people's lives and find a camaraderie in that. And that became the game of it. Forcing a lot of people to start in a place they wouldn't wish to, and then seeing what they would wish to do, and seeing how you could manifest that cumulatively, and so build a landscape made up of first the elements and then of the people who come to know the elements.
So, Finn, we're talking very much in broad terms about the novel, and it makes you do that. It's got an epic feel, Brechtian feel to it, almost. And yet you anchor it because you make it scene by vivid scene of fairly ordinary things in people's lives. And we do the work of connecting them up. Your skill in doing that is what stops the novel from floating off the table and and out into the atmosphere. And I wondered if you could just, so we can get a flavour, pick a couple of what you think are key scenes and talk about them.
Yeah, anchored is a really interesting and great choice of word. Thanks for that, because it definitely started about people who were untethered, and then it became about arrivals. And I realised this is a book of arrivals and a lot of people turning up. So people turn up in different circumstances and in different states of degradation and then kind of rebuild themselves. And I am quite a hopeful, optimistic person in life and the way I see the world. So I think this is a testament to that, which was lovely to discover when looking back at what I'd written. So here is an arrival. You meet him as somebody who's kind of wandering seemingly quite free, and then later on you come to understand that he is burdened by tragedy and guilt, and so he's carrying that and he has to heal from that. He arrived as all slept on a Sunday night, on a bicycle laden with wicker crates and hidden beneath a tilted hat, smelling of a sipping liquor swigged, if strength of stench was any guessing. As he rode through the town, he sang a truly beautiful song, and the sleeping ones in bed sighed happy as it climbed inside their dreams. The riding got slower, and eventually inertia had its way. The bicycle tipped and settled its passenger in the gutter. A wise man would have laughed then at the silliness of such a thing. The man laughed. He climbed out from beneath his bike, then fixed his hat, which had landed straight back to its sloping angle, and staggered to an alleyway. "Stay," he told the bicycle, then laughed, then hiccuped, then slid down the wall as tiredness placed a caring hand upon his shoulder and bade him go to ground. Collapsed in the shadows, he said a silent prayer of thanks that was to no single god, but rather all of them at once, for getting him through another day, and smiling at the stars he slept. He was not meant for children. One time after another he had said it, but still the thought came to him often in his dreams. The sunlight was a cruel thing as it cut across the man's eyelids. Muttering some words that were for no god to be hearing, he lifted himself and glanced down the alley. There stood his bicycle, no longer in the gutter, but now leant carefully against a lamppost. And from this simple repositioning, the man understood that this was a town that gave itself to the righting of fallen things, and he knew he would linger here a while.
Beautiful choice, yeah. And there you go. That gives you some of the specificity of it, which it needs, and that's why it works, I think. it keeps ballooning out. Everybody is themselves and yet symbolic of something more than themselves. So Nella is Nella, but she's Nella the seer.
Yes.
And Emma is Emma the Greek, the wandering, lost one. And so we're held down by those. And I'm just going to urge people to read it to find out more rather than get you to explain more. But I would like to go to the end. I don't want to talk about what happens in the end, just want to talk about what it feels like to read it. It made me cry. I thought you were letting yourself go there to somewhere amazing. It's a meditation on the end of life, on the end of our lives. And one thing I will give away is that, and it's given away by the book cover itself, the feathers, is that you imagine people coming to the end of their lives and feeling themselves growing feathers and becoming one with birds and trees. And that struck me as just amazingly beautiful. And then it took me back to the beginning of the novel. Your epigraph is from, I don't know, a Tibetan Buddhist or someone.
Yeah.
The bad news is you're falling through the air, nothing to hang on to, no parachute. The good news is there's no ground. I just love that. And that is what the whole of the end of your book is about. Tremendously moving and poetic. Did your editors say, woo, this isn't a novel? I don't know what we can do with this, or were they happy with it? I mean, what did you think you were doing there?
I alluded to the unheard voice, and that turned out to be Liz. And I thought, okay, she needs to be heard and she needs to give some context. And she essentially speaks, and she's been silent for so long, and then she needs to talk. And of course, those, you know, the weird amalgams or kind of butting up against each other of art and life. You know, this was a year of trauma and hope and resilience and love and changing love and everything for me, and, you know, sitting with a partner who kind of really was teetering on that edge, like was walking that tightrope between life and death, and notions of mortality were just weighing heavy on me. But at the same time, we were trying to raise a son without being burdened by what was happening, so I was trying to give him the most levity and the lightest year he'd ever had. And so, yeah, I was existing in this heightened state of living and this heightened state of grieving, pre-grieving, which is a strange place to be. And the book, I just let it speak to all of that. I just let this thing come out, which was about the way that we are. Like, we are all falling, but the falling doesn't need to be bad. It can be construed as flying. You can be falling with someone else. You can be falling alone. It can feel buoyant. It can feel laborious. And birds, for me, symbolise that, because I love a murmuration. I love that sense of a flock just turning in the sky and what they do, and this sense of kindred thinking and the sense of all of them catching the breeze, but also kind of making their own decisions, but making them en masse. It's just such a lovely, lovely idea of what life is, or what the future is, or what moving through a life is. And so that's what everybody became in my mind. I just let them all grow feathers and we can just all fly together, and that's it.
Just to finish, would it be okay for you to read a little bit of Anya's eulogy?
Okay, so yeah, this is Anya, who you come to know really from childhood, right up till end of days. She has a lot to get done. She's a character who ends up starting quite passive and ending up having a lot of momentum. This is a moment of her saying goodbye to someone she loves at a funeral. In urban planning, it's called a desire line. You find them in public places where a council has laid a path, but then walkers cut across the grass instead. They choose to shorten their journey, and eventually the grass wears away. Sometimes a clever bureaucrat sees the logic and paves it. They give up plans made and invest in this new one instead. It's a lovely form of practical democracy. The first desire line I ever saw, and the one I loved the most, the one I think was born of the most love, was made by my father. He grew up in a home for delinquents and orphans that was once an immigration centre, once a hospital, once a prison. It sits on the hill behind us, high enough to get snow. And between our ocean and that home, there's a forest in which the birds live. And rising out of town, up that hill, over that snow, through that forest, was a desire line. Worn away by his teenage feet after every shift he worked in a bookshop. hiking higher and higher through bracken and native grass to the place he grew up, not the walled place that held him, but the wooded place that nurtured him. And standing on a dappled rise, standing among giants, Dad would watch the birds build nests, or watch them sing, or watch them teach their young to fly, coaxing them to a precipice, launching into the air themselves, willing them to follow. An orphan watching families, a prisoner watching freedom, understanding the symbolism. And much later, after the home was closed, after I arrived, after Liz left and Mum sailed into our lives, we'd walked that desire line in the wintertime. Dad would take Emma and me to the end of town where the line began, and with jackets pulled to our chins, we'd trudge upwards through the cold, him ahead, us behind, his eyes working hard to make out the path worn in a past chapter of his life, a teenage desire for belonging worn into the earth. His boots left large impressions in the snow, and my small ones fitted inside them, so they looked like ripples, like each footprint of mine was echoing out, until finally we'd reach the 5 tall trees, the trees of his youth, and stare up together at the nests, and we'd talk about flying and landing, and the pleasure or sadness of departures, the pleasure or sadness of arrivals. Emma would smile and pour us green tea from an old thermos she always carries. I'd hold my cup with 2 hands and watch the steam rise and the leaves drip and imagine one causing the other, our breath a mist, our skeletons strong. Once or twice a year we walked that same path, the climate changing, the snow season shortening, my footprints growing bigger. Slowly they filled the impressions left by my dad until eventually one fit the other perfectly, until I had taken the lead and he and Mum, older, slower, would follow behind. Until I was the age he was when I was born, the age he lost love, found love. Until one day it wasn't him who planted the branches or trod this path in the earth anymore. That youthful path of his that led to the nest was maintained not by his footfalls, but my own. The line we now walked was mine. The steps the old couple took behind me weren't purposeful but simply patient. They were just enjoying joining me for a walk. And I saw it one day, standing in the thinning snow, staring up through the steam of the thermos tea, a bookshop and a house in the dunes, and the birds and the nests, and a line that led to them all. These are my inheritance.
And that was Finnegan Kruckemeyer reading from very close to the end of his first novel, The End and Everything Before It. It's out from Text Publishing.
And now to classics. Annie Warburton is a former ABC broadcaster and a reading tragic with very eclectic taste. She likes to take a name author from the past and have a thorough look at what they've done and what kind of legacy they've left. When she's done this for Sundoku before, she's been running with a theme she called Dead White Males. But this time, she's turned her attention to women.
I'm taking a break from Dead White Males, and having come across a Nancy Mitford novel I hadn't yet read, I decided to ask the same question, why should we read them, of dead white females? There is the broader question of why we should read the works of dead writers at all. The short answer is that if you want to understand the past, you have to read it the way it was told by people who are actually there. You can read history books, you can research the archives, but you won't get the same fully coloured picture of what life was like for a particular type of person at a particular time and in a particular place. As for watching period movies or TV series, chances are you're going to get a Bowdlerised version of the story because faithful reproduction is out and reworking history to suit modern tastes and sensibilities is in. Just look at that, to me, inexplicably popular franchise, Bridgerton. Even leaving aside the vexed issue of colourblind casting, it's just modern soap opera in fancy dress. Fine if all you want is entertainment, but if you want to understand the past, you have to read those who wrote it the way they wrote it. I've always been interested in early 20th century history in England, from the Edwardian era at the start, when British power and prestige were at their peak, to the post-war years and the decline of empire. The Mitford sisters lived through all this, and their writings illuminate the customs, culture and attitudes of their class over these years of tumultuous change. They were the 6 daughters of Lord and Lady Redesdale, who were almost caricatures of the landed gentry that called their grand country mansions huises, set in extensive grounds they called parks, and who spent their days riding, hunting and shooting, and trailed by dogs. There was one son who went to Oxford, but he was killed in the war. The girls had no formal schooling whatsoever, but they somehow acquired formidable literacy and extensive knowledge of European languages, history and politics. Nancy was the oldest, and though they were all prolific letter writers and memoirists, she became the writer of the family, capturing in fiction the picaresque, larger-than-life, sometimes horrifying, often amusing, always fascinating adventures of herself and her siblings, most famously in her books The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate. Her sister Diana, a famous beauty of her time, married the heir to the Guinness fortune but left him for Oswald Mosley, leader of the British fascists. Adolf Hitler went to their wedding. Diana and Mosley were both interned during the war, dobbed in by Sister Nancy as security threats. Sister Unity was a thoroughgoing Hitler groupie. At the outbreak of World War II in Germany, she shot herself, and the family took her back to England to live out the rest of her life as an invalid. Sister Jessica became a communist, eloped with a like-minded young man, and went off to the Spanish Civil War, becoming the model for Linda, the doomed heroine in The Pursuit of Love, except that, unlike Linda, Jessica didn't die in childbirth but went to America, where she wrote The American Way of Death, a scathing commentary on the venality of the American funeral industry. She also wrote Hons and Rebels, an autobiographical account of her childhood, Hons being short for honourable, as in the Honourable Mrs. Mitford. It included such astonishing stories as how Lord Redesdale used to stage full-on mounted hunts in the ancestral park with the children as prey, and the children loved it. The younger sisters proved to be pragmatic and adaptable. Sister Pamela became a farmer. Sister Deborah married the Duke of Devonshire and became the chatelaine of Chatsworth House. She was one of the first aristocrats to grasp that in post-war Labour-governed England you could not maintain these grand stately homes under the old semi-feudal tenancy regime, and she turned it into a money-making concern by opening it up for public visitation. In Nancy's fictionalised family saga, they are the Radletts, and the crazy patriarch is Lord Alkenley. Don't Tell Alfred is the third and last in the trilogy, after The Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, which finishes at the end of World War II. Don't Tell Alfred takes us forward in time to the late 1950s. As with the 2 earlier books, it's narrated by Fanny, daughter of the Bolter. Bolter being what the English aristocracy calls a woman who abandons her class destiny to marry and produce heirs to run off with an unsuitable suitor. Fun facts. Both Princess Diana's mother and Sarah Ferguson's mother were upper-class bolters. Diana's mother ditched Lord Spencer to marry an Australian sheep station owner, and Fergie's mother ran off with an Argentine polo player. Because her mother bolted, Fanny was raised by Lord and Lady Alkenley in the company of her Radlett cousins. Traumatised by her mother's absence and craving stability, she marries Alfred Wincham, a quiet, rather dull Oxford don who lives up to his promise as a devoted husband and father. They have 4 sons, one of them the orphan child of Fanny's cousin Linda, the one who died giving birth to the son of her aristocratic lover Fabrice, a French army officer killed during the war. The story starts with Alfred being appointed British ambassador to Paris, an unlikely circumstance given Alfred is a theologian, not a diplomat. But Nancy Mitford having lived there from the end of the war until her death in 1973, it's the natural choice for her satire on the manners, fashions and preoccupations of the Anglo-European elites of the time. Don't Tell Alfred was first published in 1960. I'm reading Penguin's 2015 reissue. It's the first book I've ever come across that has the trigger warning about, quote, depictions of prejudices that were commonplace in British society at the time it was written. These prejudices were wrong then, and they are wrong today. Penguin goes on to say they're publishing it as written because to do otherwise would be to pretend that such prejudices did not exist. Well, good for them, and I might have missed something, but I'm not sure what prejudices they're talking about. There's no outright racial prejudice because all the characters are white Anglos or Europeans. It could be the class prejudice. Let's not forget that it was Nancy Mitford who wrote the guide to you, as in upper class, and non-you speech, how you could tell instantly who was upper by whether they looked into a mirror, lower class, or a looking glass, upper class, or whether they had a mantelpiece, so common, or a chimney piece, the correct form. But this was all very tongue-in-cheek, and she was actually criticised by writer and fellow aristocrat Evelyn Waugh for, quote, lobbing a grenade into upper-class complacency and for revealing its shibboleths. You'd be on more solid ground with an accusation of class prejudice if you noted the way servants are only referred to as functionaries with no authorial interest in their lives. When Fanny and Alfred's second son David arrives from the east with a hippie-ish girlfriend and a baby in tow, Fanny says she'll send her maid up to help them unpack. She's interested in this infuriatingly taciturn girlfriend and the baby, but only because they're attached to her son. The girl may well be as common as the maid, but we never find out. All Fanny gets from David in response to her prying about the girl, the baby and their plans is a series of vaguely Buddhist pieties on the meaninglessness of social status and time and material possessions and bourgeois morality. David scorns his parents' wealth and social standing while taking full advantage of the comforts they offer. Mitford's tone here is deeply satirical, both of David's hypocrisy and of the half-baked Eastern philosophy he spouts. Is this the wrong prejudice Penguin is talking about? Is Mitford being anti-Asian? Before they learn that the baby, Chang, is actually the child of David's Zen guru, they note that it is yellow-skinned. This could be construed as a racial slur, but Fanny adores the baby and wants to keep him. There is, of course, that underlying assumption, present in all English writing from Shakespeare's time, of British superiority over foreigners in general. In the two earlier books in the trilogy, there's a lovely comic thread to do with Lord Alkenley's oft-stated disdain for the non-British. When Linda is briefly stranded at a railway station in Paris, before being rescued by Fabrice, taken to his palatial Paris home and made his mistress, she wails, "Far is right, abroad is beastly, and foreigners are fiends." Here, Mitford's British characters express the same exasperation with the ways of foreigners, in the privacy of the British Embassy, of course. If anything, Mitford's strongest prejudice is against Americans. There's the character who comes back from Soviet Russia, having once spouted fashionable pro-socialist views, but now finding any number of excuses for the failings of the workers' paradise. He comes across as an arrogant blowhard. The wife of the American ambassador is a rich vein of satire. When this Mildred meets David, the son in thrall to Eastern mysticism, she gives full rein to contemporary psychobabble. She talks enthusiastically about the interchange of ideas between sentient contemporary human creatures and exploding the forms and habits of thought imposed by authority. Fanny says, one saw why she was such an asset in society. She could produce the right line of talk in its correct jargon for every occasion. There are two central comedic plot lines in Don't Tell Alfred. The first is the refusal of the wife of the previous ambassador to vacate the premises. The second is a diplomatic row between Britain and France over some uninhabited rocks in the English Channel known as les îles Manquillères. In handling these contretemps, Fanny and Alfred are plagued by the presence of the local correspondent for the Times of London, who for some reason has it in for Alfred and who never fails to spin against him in any diplomatic brouhaha. Fanny calls in Uncle Davy, the family fixer, whose charm and general savoir-faire have rescued the Radletts on previous occasions. He's an upper-class eccentric in the grand tradition, but well-connected on both sides of the channel. Fanny hopes he might be able to schmooze the dug-in previous ambassadress, mollify the French government over the Ile Manquière, counter the animosity of the hostile newspaperman, and most importantly, talk sense into her wayward children. Both her eldest sons did well at Oxford, but have chucked all that in for Eastern mysticism in David's case, and in the case of oldest son Basil, bumming around Europe, making money out of showing tourists around and planning to catch more money off his wealthy grandfather to maybe set up a travel agency. He talks like a beatnik, well, sort of. He calls people kiddo and talks about discs and of pop and jazz, as if these categories were interchangeable. Elvis and rock and roll don't get a mention, although this is the late 50s. Mitford, I think, has inklings of the coming youth revolution, but hasn't quite grasped its lingo, I fear. The two youngest boys are also a worry. They've run away from Eton and turn up in the retinue of a pop singer called Yankee Fonzie. And they talk of going driftin' with Yankee, driftin' being slang for going on tour. Fanny and Alfred aren't happy about their son's youthful rebelliousness, and there's a lot of discussion along the lines of young folks today, cosseted, undisciplined, ungrateful, etc., etc., which strikes a contemporary, even a timeless note. But their dismay is pretty mild. Alfred says he wouldn't mind so much the boys calling him Dad instead of Father, if only they didn't pronounce it Dod. Fanny reflects that her generation of young women were more outrageous in their rebellion against class destiny. Her cousin Linda, for instance, running off with a communist and becoming pregnant to a married Frenchman who picks her up at a railway station. There's another young person in the story. It's Fanny's niece Northie, an animal-loving proto-vegan recruited to the embassy as a social secretary. She's a scatterbrain, but she is pretty and immediately attracts a suite of male admirers from whom she gleans vital social and political gossip, thus proving herself very useful to Fanny and Alfred. She causes Fanny some anxiety about unsuitable romantic liaisons, but there's a kind of underlying assumption that familial wealth and privilege will prove irresistible in the end, and that the kids will eventually come home to it, as did Linda and even Auntie Bolter, when the going got tough during the war. Yankee Fonzie, it's a curiously unlikely name for a 50s pop sensation. It's actually a rather contrived play on words by Mitford, which she uses as the comic punchline for her novel. A riotous crowd turns up in the British Embassy courtyard, apparently yelling, "Manquière Française," to the dismay of those within who think they've got a diplomatic incident on their hands over the disputed islands. But these supposed French patriots turn out to be a crowd of Yankees' youthful fans following their idol to the British Embassy, whence they've been lured by the ambassador's teenage sons. The crowd was actually yelling, "Yankee Fonzie!" I came across a review of Don't Tell Alfred, written by the unapologetically elitist Evelyn Waugh, shortly after the book's publication in 1960. He concedes Nancy Mitford has created a nice social satire with it, while adding, it is, of course, at heart, a socialist tract. Well, you can't get a clearer, more accurate, historical snapshot of time and place than that.
Reviewer Annie Warburton talking about the amazing Mitford sisters, particularly Nancy Mitford, and just makes you want to dive back in, probably to a second-hand shop, grab those books again and read them all over again.
You're listening to Sundaku with me, Kath Keneally, and Annie Hastwell. And we'd just like to remind you that we're always interested to hear from you if you'd like to get in touch and tell us what you've been reading.
I really remember my books through high school. Crazy books like The Nugget and the Stars, which was this strange Australian novel for teens about identity, really, and about finding yourself through difficulties. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and the Ruth Park series, The Mayor of Casterbridge and 1984 and all those wonderful classics. And yeah, I'm the type of person that would become so invested in them that nothing else mattered. In my adult life, I read the book Les Miserables, which was very long but really worth it. I read the book Shantaram, which almost paralleled my life at a particular time, about an Australian person going to live in India. And when I was in India, one of the most powerful reading experiences I had was The Life of Pi, which is beautiful because I love animals, and The White Tiger, which was so viscerally meaningful for me at the time. I read a lot of George Monbiot's work because it's about themes that I'm really interested in. That is, where are we going as society? I've also read a lot about sort of the history of humanity. That's always been an ongoing thing. So I read Sapiens, and then I've just finished reading The Dawn of Everything, which opened up a whole new way of thinking about we as humanity. Then I read a lot about what gardens and plants mean for us. So Entangled Life by Mandrake, and The Well-Gardened Mind, such a beautiful book, and The Secret Life of Trees, so much about mycorrhizal activity in forests and communication between plants, and what plants and gardens and things do for us. I read a fantastic book called The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson, about a couple in which one is transitioning from a woman to a man. Amazingly beautifully written book. And the other classification I have is religious books and spiritual books. So one of my favourite books is My Gita by Devdutt Patnaik. It's a beautiful explanation of the Bhagavad Gita. I think reading is like a very deeply human external hard drive, and I often think about how having access to that external hard drive of human, not just knowledge, but experience, has profoundly changed the way we think and who we are as communities of people.
And if you do want to tell us about your reading habits, you can contact us at sundakucast@gmail.com.
And that's it for another Sundaku episode. Hope you've enjoyed it. I'm Kath Keneally. Thank you for your company.
And I'm Annie Hastwell. Keep reading.
This podcast is produced by 4 book addicts refusing treatment.
Kath Keneally.
Michaela Andreev.
Annie Hastwell.
And me, Sarah Martin. Our thanks to composer Quincy Grant for the music. If you want to know more about the books and authors featured in this episode, check out the show notes. And you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sundokukast, TSUNDOKU cast.